By the autumn of 1944, the war in Western Europe had shifted from rapid movement to grinding exhaustion. Entire towns were flattened, rail lines were broken, and the countryside was crowded with people who no longer knew where they belonged. Among them were thousands of German women, clerks, radio operators, factory workers, nurses, auxiliaries, and civilians swept up as the front collapsed, now classified as prisoners of war or detainees under Allied control. They were marched, transported, and reassigned again and again as camps filled faster than they could be organized. Many of these women expected captivity to mean interrogation, confinement, and uncertainty. What they did not expect was how quickly their bodies would begin to fail from work meant for men, performed in winter, with almost nothing to protect their hands. By the time they said it out loud, "Our hands are bleeding," it was already too late. The first camp was temporary, little more than a fenced clearing outside a ruined industrial town. Barbed wire ran in uneven lines. Watchtowers were improvised from salvaged timber. The ground was hard-packed earth mixed with broken stone and ash from nearby factories that had burned earlier that year. The women arrived in groups of 20 to 40, escorted by American infantry units rotating off the front. Some wore remnants of uniforms, faded gray coats without insignia, boots that no longer fit. Others were dressed in civilian clothing that had already been worn thin by years of rationing and evacuation. There was no formal intake at first. Names were written down when possible. Ages were estimated. Occupations were noted only if someone asked. Most of the guards were young Americans who had never expected to be responsible for women at all, let alone hundreds of them. Work assignments began almost immediately. The camp needed expansion. Trenches had to be dug for drainage. Barracks frames needed to be erected. Debris from nearby roads had to be cleared so supply trucks could pass through mud and snow. None of this work was unusual for POW camps in late 1944. What was unusual was who was doing it. The women were handed tools, shovels, picks, axes, rusted wire cutters salvaged from abandoned German depots. There were no gloves. None were issued. The supply units prioritized food, tents, and fuel. Hand protection simply wasn't available. At first, the women said nothing. They worked with stiff fingers in the cold, digging into frozen soil that tore skin with every strike. Wood splintered into palms, wire cut into flesh. Blisters formed, then split. Blood soaked into cloth wrappings torn from undershirts and scarves. By the third day, many could barely grip their tools. By the fifth, some could no longer straighten their fingers. Still, they worked, not because they were ordered to, but because stopping meant punishment, reduced rations, or being singled out for questioning. Most had already learned that silence was safer than complaint. The American guards noticed the injuries slowly. At first, it was just stains. Dark marks on sleeves, red smears on tool handles. One guard joked that the women must be clumsy. Another assumed it was normal. Then one morning, during roll call, a woman in the second row dropped her shovel. It fell into the mud with a dull sound. She didn't bend to pick it up. Her hands were wrapped in strips of cloth already soaked through. When she tried to move her fingers, they trembled uncontrollably. Blood dripped from the wrappings onto the frozen ground. An American sergeant shouted for her to move. She didn't. Instead, another woman beside her spoke, quietly at first, then louder when no one reacted. "Our hands are bleeding." The words weren't shouted. They weren't dramatic. They were factual, almost exhausted. The sergeant looked closer. For the first time, he really looked. Nearly every woman in that line had their hands wrapped. Some used socks, some used torn shirts, others had nothing at all, exposing cracked skin and open wounds swollen from cold and infection. The work stopped that morning. Not officially. No order was given, but the tools weren't raised again. The sergeant called for a medic. The medic arrived annoyed, expecting minor complaints. What he found instead was a line of women whose hands looked more like those of factory accident victims than laborers. Cuts layered over cuts, skin split to the muscle, fingers numb from cold exposure. He said one word that changed everything. Infected. Word moved up the chain faster than usual. This wasn't a matter of discipline. It wasn't refusal to work. It was a medical failure. The Geneva Conventions required humane treatment of prisoners, including medical care. These women weren't enemy combatants in the traditional sense. Many weren't soldiers at all. By evening, the camp commander had walked the worksite himself. He didn't speak German. They didn't speak English. But pain doesn't require translation. That night, orders were changed. Work continued, but only after modifications. Gloves were requisitioned from supply depots, even if they weren't standard issue. When gloves ran out, burlap sacks were cut and wrapped around palms. Scarves were repurposed. Grease from vehicle maintenance was rubbed into cracked skin to slow splitting. It wasn't kindness. It was necessity. But to the women, it felt like something else. It felt like being seen. The medical tent became the most important place in the camp. Hands were washed in cold water because warm water was scarce. Antiseptic was applied sparingly. Bandages were reused, boiled when possible. Some women cried, not from pain, but from relief at being allowed to sit while their wounds were treated. Others were angry. They asked why it had taken so long. No one answered. Work assignments were adjusted. Heavy digging was reduced. Lighter tasks, sorting supplies, kitchen labor, mending, were assigned to those whose hands could no longer hold tools. But the damage was already done. Some women lost sensation permanently. Nerve damage from cold and infection lingered. Fingers stiffened. Joints swelled. For a few, gangrene became a threat, requiring evacuation to larger medical facilities behind the lines. Rumors spread through the camp. Some said the Americans were testing how much the women could endure. Others believed the suffering was punishment for German crimes elsewhere. A few whispered that the Americans were different, that if you spoke up, they listened. No one knew what to believe. The guards struggled too. Many were teenagers or barely older, raised in towns where women were mothers, sisters, sweethearts. Seeing injured women under their watch unsettled them. One gun guard wrote in a letter home that he felt like he was guarding ghosts. Winter worsened everything. Snow fell early. Frost settled into the barracks at night. Hands that had begun to heal split open again with the cold. The women wrapped their hands before sleeping, tucking them under armpits to keep them warm. Some slept sitting up, afraid to stretch their fingers too far. Every morning, roll call revealed new bandages, and every day the question returned, how long? No one answered that either. By January 1945, the camp was reorganized entirely. The women were moved to a more permanent facility with wooden barracks, indoor workspaces, and scheduled medical inspections. Work quotas were reduced. Hot soup was added once per day. It wasn't comfort, but it was survival. One American lieutenant, older than most, spoke some German. He gathered a small group of women and explained haltingly that the war was nearing its end, that conditions would improve, that they would not be worked to death. Some believed him, some didn't. But when gloves were finally issued properly, thick, ill-fitting, but real, the women understood that something had shifted. It wasn't mercy. It was accountability. The hands slowly healed. Scars remained, fingers never fully straightened for some. But the bleeding stopped. Years later, survivors would remember that moment, not the first day of captivity, not the end of the war, but the day someone finally noticed their hands. The day they said it out loud. Our hands are bleeding. And someone listened. If these stories matter to you and you want them to reach more people, please consider liking the video and subscribing. Your support helps keep these stories alive.